This video is meant to give you a brief primer on what interest groups are and what they do. Interest groups are associations of like-minded individuals who attempt to influence government policy. In the United States, these types of associations form around almost any issue that you can think of. And the trend has been toward more interest group activity in recent decades. In the late 1950s, the Encyclopedia of Associations, the most authoritative source of information on these types of groups, identified 6,000 organizations operating with a national scope. By the year 2008, the encyclopedia identified over 22,000 organizations working at the national level. And beyond that, they found over 100,000 groups operating at the state and local level. So American politics has become more and more deeply shaped by interest group activity and their efforts to shape what government does. Interest groups, because they are relatively narrow in scope, focus on a specific issue of interest to their members, can provide a clear voice to policymakers about what at least a certain segment of the population would like government to do. Along with political parties, they're one of the primary means by which people become engaged in collective political endeavors. Interest groups and political parties are distinct in a couple of very important ways. Parties exist to win elections, so they try to make broad appeals to wide swaths of the population. This can be good for trying to represent the voices of average citizens, but it can also lead to somewhat muddled or ambiguous policy commitments. Parties tend to signal their stances on policy issues in somewhat general, lofty principles without getting so specific as to alienate voters that might disagree with some of the specifics or details. Interest groups, on the other hand, exist to win specific government policies that advance their group's interests. This means that they get much more specific about policy details. Related to this, parties are policy generalists, meaning they take broad stands on a wide variety of different issues. Parties seek to highlight a general approach to an assortment of issues that they think will help them to appeal to a majority of the electorate. Interest groups, on the other hand, are policy specialists, meaning they devote themselves to becoming experts focused on one particular issue area. Since there are so many different interest groups out there, it's useful to distinguish some broad categories of different types of groups. Generally speaking, the interest group environment can be broken down into three main types: economic, citizen, and government groups. Economic groups are interest groups that are formed around some common economic interest. This would include things like business and corporate groups, trade associations, labor unions, and professional associations. So the Chamber of Commerce, the American Federation of Teachers, and the American Medical Association are all groups that at their core involve protecting the economic interests of their members. That doesn't mean that's all they do, of course. Teachers' unions are concerned about quality education, and the AMA is concerned about improving healthcare. But their engagement and perspective on those issues is informed by the professional economic interests of their members. The second type of group, citizen groups, differs from the economic groups because the groups are organized around some idea of promoting the common good apart from the economic interests of its members. In other words, these are interest groups made up of people who are passionate about a particular issue. So, for instance, on the issue of abortion, you see several groups active on different sides. For instance, the National Abortion Rights Action League, which is very active in trying to protect abortion rights, or Americans United for Life, which works to try to restrict abortion. The people active in these groups have organized themselves into these associations not because they seek some type of economic benefit from government, but because they're deeply committed to their ideas about how to foster a better society. And finally, the third type of interest group are government groups. In our complicated system of federalism, different levels of government have felt it necessary to bind together to try to press their case. So, for example, the National Governors Association represents governors of all 50 states and works collectively to try to influence policy in Washington, D.C. in ways that give more money and more decision-making authority to the states. Similarly, local government associations, like the United States Conference of Mayors, advocates at both the state and local level to try to advance the particular interests of cities. So what do interest groups do? How do they pursue their goals to influence government decisions? Interest group activity generally falls into three categories: lobbying, grassroots activity, and campaign finance and electioneering. Let's take a look at each of these. Lobbying involves communications between interest group members or representatives and public officials with the intent of trying to influence government decisions. Lobbying is something that is perceived in a pretty bad light by the general public, with visions of politicians being bought off by lobbyists and backroom deals being made in ways that help special interests, but at the expense of the public good. And the public definitely has legitimate reasons to view lobbying that way. But there are elements of lobbying that are less pernicious and can act to improve government decision making. Lobbyists very rarely are direct sources of cash or campaign contributions for politicians. Instead, they're assets to politicians because they're sources of expert information. Most government policymaking, in terms of writing laws or drafting regulations, requires a fair amount of technical detail in order to create policy that will actually achieve its objectives in the real world. Politicians are policy generalists. They have to pay attention to and vote on all sorts of different issues. They only have so much time and energy to become expert in a single area. Lobbyists, because their interest groups are passionately devoted to single issues, develop lots of technical expertise in that area. That expertise is incredibly valuable to government decision makers. Lobbyists also signal political information to politicians about how much support or opposition will develop around particular policy proposals. That's important information for government officials who are interested in putting together a policy that will gain enough support to actually be enacted and implemented. A second major area of interest group action is grassroots activity. This consists of actions meant to strengthen the organization and mobilize public opinion. So all groups try to cultivate a good public image, because the more an interest group can convince policymakers that they have the public behind them, the more likely they are to succeed in winning favorable policies. Interest groups engage in a wide assortment of marketing strategies to try to influence public opinion and rally public opinion around the interest group's position on its issues. And perhaps most importantly, interest groups alert their members to contact politicians when key votes or other decisions are about to be made. If a group can successfully mobilize its members to call their representatives to support or oppose a particular policy, that makes an impression on public officials, because they know that a citizen motivated enough to contact their representative is likely going to vote in the next election based on whether that representative adopted the group's position. Finally, interest groups participate in campaign finance and electioneering. Lobbying and grassroots activity can be effective means of swaying government decision makers to adopt favorable policies to the group. But perhaps the best way for interest groups to win favorable policy is by getting like-minded people elected to office. The most common form of interest group activity in this area is by contributing money to candidates and political parties through political action committees, or PACs. PAC contributions can help candidates supported by the interest group to win an election, but there are limits on how much money an interest group can contribute. So many groups set up independent expenditure committees, sometimes referred to as super PACs. Rather than funneling money to candidates or parties, super PACs spend directly to influence elections, usually by running ads against candidates the group would like to see defeated. There are no limits on super PAC spending, so long as the group does not directly coordinate its efforts with a candidate or political party. This allows very wealthy special interests to spend huge sums of money, basically running parallel campaigns to the actual official campaigns of the candidates running for office.